I'm Barry Lynn Schwartz. I think most of you know that. I'm one of the co-presidents of NCJW Bergen County section, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Yom HaShoah Lunch and Learn. We've had a little glitch, so I want to tell you that to begin with. We have 3 of our wonderful members are in Florida, one of whom is Peggy Capico, who is our Yom HaShoah chair. Their Wi-Fi just crashed, all 3 of them. Peggy was on earlier. She was on at 12:15, and she had the distinct pleasure of introducing Sandy Rubenstein, our speaker. So I am doing this without any preparation. So I hope that I will be coherent. I'm sure I will not be as clever as Peggy would have been. So I think you all know that we really have a very special program today. Sandy is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and she's also a Holocaust educator. And she has, I think the number of years is, and if I'm wrong, I'm sure you can correct me, Sandy, about 40 years of experience teaching about the Holocaust at very distinguished schools and with lots of kids and lots of adults. And also just this weekend, last night, not this weekend, yesterday and today, last night and today, she is doing 3 presentations. So this is going to be very special. I also want you to know that Sandy has agreed to provide personalized book plates for those of you who purchase the book. We will send out the link of where you can purchase the book. It's also available if you wish to read it at the libraries through Bookles. And we will give you instructions on how we will get you a personalized book plate. You've all been muted. We are going to have a Q&A after the presentation. If you put your questions into the chat, we will ask them during the Q&A. And I think I've covered the housekeeping rules, and I hope I've done justice to Sandy. Sandy, take it away.
Thank you, Peggy. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, everybody can see that, I hope. So I'm honored to be here. And I want to extend thanks to so many people who made this Lunch and Learn possible, to Karen Kurland and Paula Schwartz for arranging this surprise lunch, for all the women who delivered the lunch. Paula Starr came to my home. And thank you in general to the National Council, to Elaine Meyerson, to Barry Lynn Schwartz, to Peggy Capico, and Ginny Wasserman, and all of you for this special opportunity to speak to you today. Yesterday, April 7th, was Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and this month we commemorate the lives and heroism of the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust. I am a child of survivors. Both my parents survived the Holocaust. When the war began in 1939, my father was 12 years old, my mother was 10. And at war's end, my father was the sole survivor of his family. These are my parents, Joseph and Dinah Horn. My mother passed away in 2016 at the age of 87. And when my sisters and I were cleaning out her apartment, I found my father's wallet. It had been in the top drawer of his desk for many, many years, untouched since he passed away. I opened the wallet and I found the predictable credit cards and photos, but there was also a yellowed piece of paper folded, tucked into his wallet, something my father had written and kept as a constant reminder. And it said, "Remember, hate is tenacious, memory is fragile." It was in 1996 when his book, Mark It With a Stone, was published. And this memoir was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Reading his manuscript was when I first learned of the depth of the devastating details of his ordeal. In 1995, he was also interviewed by Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. Many of you know that between 1994 and 1999, 52,000 Holocaust survivors, rescuers, witnesses, and liberators had their testimonies recorded. And my father was one of those who did give testimony. So in addition to his memoir, we have this 3-hour visual and oral testimony, which is a gift for his family and for future generations. It's a tribute to the loved ones who perished, and it's a record of his ordeal. Today, he will speak to you directly about his experiences through excerpts from his memoir and video clips from his Shoah testimony. His story is about sharing memory and why it is important to do so. It is a personal story. It is an indictment of what can happen when we remain silent in the face of evil. It's about the prejudice that fuels the hatred, but it is also about courage, hope, and the strength of the human spirit. As survivors age and are no longer with us, this primary source allows us and future generations to witness history firsthand. And here, my father speaks about his desire to survive.
Auschwitz was the culmination of all my experiences. And I remember when I left Auschwitz, and one day in November when they evacuated us, my great dream and desire was to survive, to bear witness. That was the greatest desire I had, was to survive and bear witness.
For your family?
For my family, for my friends, and for what I saw in Auschwitz. What is indelibly marked in my brain. If I live to be 1,000, some of the things that I saw, I remember as if I saw them yesterday.
So this is a photo of our family. I'm the older sister, and a third sister was born after this photo was taken. So I was the oldest, and I was also very curious. And I yearned to understand what happened. I saw the unexplained tattoos on their inner arms. I knew my parents spoke English with an accent. I had no grandparents. At the age of 10, I found a black notebook in a basement closet with my father's familiar handwriting scrawled on the yellowed loose leaf pages. And I fell upon the notebook knowing I was on the verge of uncovering the answers to so many of my unspoken questions about his past. And as I read, I learned the painful truth about how my father lost his entire family. I believe that when we talk about statistics such as 6 million, it's impossible to comprehend the enormity of such a catastrophe. But to tell one personal story, that I believe has the power to touch the hearts of others. So it looks like we have a problem here. Prejudice, violence, crimes against humanity, and genocide are still occurring in the world today. Darfur, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, ISIS, and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims fleeing Myanmar, and even most recently, the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims in China. We are living in a time of COVID. It's a pandemic that has upended our lives. And we must be mindful too that the world's newest disease has unleashed another wave of the world's oldest hate, anti-Semitism. Hatred is on the rise in Germany and around the world, and bigotry is deeply embedded in our society. Internet use and social media allow misinformation, conspiracy theories, and hatred to surge in ways that are not only blatant, but also subtle. And in today's environment of viral headlines and retweets, the speed with which a lie can spread has become supersonic. Over the last few years, domestic terrorism targeting Jews and other minorities has escalated. Words matter. In Charlottesville, Virginia, a white nationalist rally erupted into violence. Carrying flags with swastikas, neo-Nazis armed with semi-automatic rifles stormed the streets shouting, "Blood and soil, Jews will not replace us." And then on October 26, 2018, armed with an AR-15 assault rifle, a man shouting anti-Semitic slurs opened fire inside a crowded Pittsburgh synagogue during the morning service, killing 11 congregants simply because of their faith. It was a rampage described as the deadliest against the Jewish people in the United States. And then on January 6th, there was an attack at the Capitol. I don't know why it's not allowing me to go forward. Thank you for your patience while I try to figure this out. Okay. This attack was fueled by white supremacists and militia groups. Some of the hate symbols on display during the ransacking of one of our most sacred institutions included a long-haired, bearded man wearing a black Camp Auschwitz t-shirt emblazoned with a skull and crossbones. Anti-Semitism has been a fact of life for more than 2,000 years. What must we do? It is a complicated question, but we know this. It is our responsibility to speak up and to speak out against hatred. So let me tell you about my dad. To me, he was handsome, wise, sensitive, and strong. He embraced life passionately. He appreciated each day. He taught us to do the same. And he loved this country fiercely, ever grateful for its dedication to freedom. He was always my role model and remains so to this day. As his daughter, I've always felt the desire to measure up, to follow in his footsteps, to be like him, a person of conscience and strong moral character. He was born in a city called Radom in Poland on November 15, 1926. He was the youngest of 4 children. And he remembers his home as a place of love, security, and traditional Jewish life. Were it not for the terrible anti-Semitism that he had to live with, his childhood would have been ideal. But there was much prejudice and bigotry toward Jews in Poland at that time. But for my father, the full effect of this hatred was not realized until he witnessed a soccer game played one summer afternoon. It was 1938. He was 11 years old. And I'm going to read an excerpt from his memoir about that day. One day, while walking home from the railroad station, my father gave me some very good news. One of the Jewish soccer teams from Radom, the Hapoel, was scheduled to play the Polish team in Pionki the following Sunday. I love to play soccer and love to watch it played. Two of my cousins, twins, played striker on the Hapoel. And all week, that upcoming match was the first thing I thought of when I woke each morning. I even arranged with my mother to have a basket of goodies to hand out to my cousins and the others at halftime. The day of the event finally came. I was at the stadium ahead of everybody. I watched the bus with the Radom players pull in and was very proud of the healthy-looking Jewish young men getting off. I greeted my cousins and showed them the basket that mother had filled with lemons, apples, strawberries, and a jar of lemonade. When it was time to play ball, the Jewish team took the field dressed in blue and white jerseys and lined up in the center of the ballpark. My heart sank when the spectators greeted them with hisses and anti-Semitic catcalls. But then the Polish home team ran out. They were dressed in red and white, and the cheers were deafening. Play began, and within 5 minutes, the Hapoel team scored. Because I was surrounded by Poles, I was afraid to cheer, but still it felt so good inside. As to confirm my happiness, they scored another goal within minutes. And by halftime, the score stood at 2-0. I took my basket of goodies and ran to the Jewish side, where I quickly distributed my treasure trove. I was a little kid in the company of big boys, and nobody paid much attention to me except my two cousins. But as I milled among the players, I sensed a lack of excitement. They seemed strangely subdued for a team with a solid halftime lead. When the whistle blew and it was time to go back on the field, one of my cousins leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Go home now, we are going to lose." I was stunned and didn't move. And as he ran onto the field, he turned and motioned again for me to go home. And then I understood. They had to throw the game to avoid a massacre, and he didn't want me to see their defeat. I walked home, my spirit completely crushed. Somehow, the precariousness of being Jewish sunk in at that moment more deeply than ever before. And that afternoon, on the way home from that soccer game, I decided to fight hatred and bigotry for the rest of my life, even though the struggle was about to become harder than I could possibly have imagined. Kristallnacht had taken place in Germany. Political discussions took place around the dinner table as the clouds of war were darkening. Nazi Germany was rearming at a frantic pace. On September 1st, 1939, bombs began to fall and Hitler's tanks rumbled into the city of Radom. He was 12 years old and explains what it was like on that day.
A plane flew overhead over the city, and it left a mark, which evidently was the sign to the ground troops that the city is empty and it is ready to be entered. And after about half hour, I heard a mighty roar coming in from the western side of the city. And we knew that the Germans were entering the city. And so I overcame my fright, all my emotions. And as a curious child, I ran to the road that I knew the Germans were coming in from. And I watched the whole array of this great German might, tank after tank after tank, with these tankers with their goggles, with this tremendous might, with the long guns on their tanks. And that made a tremendous impression on me. I just thought that this kind of might will conquer the world. No ifs and buts about it. That's how powerful they loomed at the time.
So with the occupation came a spate of new laws. And at first, these laws applied to the general public, but soon specific laws were issued against Jews only. All Jewish schools were closed. Jewish bank accounts were frozen. Jews could no longer practice their professions. His parents insisted he join a clandestine school. It was very costly and dangerous, but education was considered as important as life itself. And for the first time, he applied himself to his studies. In November of 1939, my father turned 13. And his parents decided, despite the dire consequences, that he should observe his bar mitzvah. And here he shares that memory.
We had a bar mitzvah rite in an apartment that was owned by a rabbi who lived in the apartment complex that we lived in. And he had created a room that was camouflaged with a wardrobe so that no one would know that there is an entry, that there's a room there. And it was in this room that we went in to pray, because praying, of course, under the Germans was forbidden, under the pain of death immediately as soon as they entered. And but my parents insisted, and we did go through this ritual, and we went into this room in the rabbi's house that was camouflaged with this wardrobe. And when I was about to begin reciting the Haftorah, Germans came in. We heard on the outside the, rough shuffling with the screams, "Juden raus, Juden raus." And everybody froze. And the Germans actually came into the room, to the apartment where the rabbi lived. And they asked loudly, "Where are the males? Where are the men?" Because they were at that point, it was early in the war, they would come down and raid the Jewish neighborhoods and grab males so that they would work for them and abuse them for whatever reasons they had. So they were on one of these raids that they came into that apartment. Well, we were very close to having someone come in there, because they actually went into opened the wardrobe doors from the other side, and one of them went into the wardrobe to look, but somehow he didn't find. And so eventually they left. And I asked the people that were present there if I should continue reading the Haftorah, and everybody said, yes, go ahead and do. And so this is how we celebrated my bar mitzvah.
Soon after, his oldest brother, Abram, who was 20 years old at the time, decided it was not safe for him to stay in Radom and that he wanted to escape to the Russian-occupied side of Poland. And so the family paid smugglers to take Abram. And in the dead of night, defying the curfew, my father accompanied him to a truck stop where a vehicle was to take him to the border. He said goodbye to his brother that night and never saw him again. Hitler's aim was to conquer the world.
When the Germans conquered France and Paris fell, all of a sudden everybody realized that Hitler is for real, that the mighty French army was defeated by then in several weeks. So they all had a right to think that Hitler is invincible, that his armies are invincible. In fact, at the time they were. So all these people, these so-called political fence sitters that we have in every country, toppled over to the side of the Nazis. And then things began to get tough.
So we're talking about after the spring of 1940.
40, right. After the spring of 1940, things began to get tougher and tougher. Right? And that was the time when the laws were passed where we needed to wear the armbands with the stars, and many other laws were passed that continually tightened the noose, economic and political, around us.
In March of 1941, the ghetto in Radom was formed, and more than 35,000 Jews were penned into a small area. Conditions rapidly deteriorated. Food was scarce, and terrible rumors began to spread, creating a constant state of fear. Words like deportation, resettlement, transfer, expulsion crept into the vocabulary, and nobody understood their true meaning. My father and his brother Eli worked a 12-hour shift in a munitions factory. The Germans had deluded the Jews to believe that by working, the family would be safe. But this was not to be. A mass deportation of Jews in Radom occurred on October 15, 1942. My father's mother, father, and sister, Luma, were taken that day. They were sent to Treblinka, a death camp where they met a terrible end. And here he speaks about his 3 siblings.
Abram was born 1990. He was a very bright young man. He graduated either number 2 or number 3 at the head of his class in high school, in a school which attracted the best brains in the city. So for him to be number 2 or number 3 was really a great accomplishment. He was great in physics and math, and the whole family believed that he was going to be a famous scientist one day. We were really all convinced of that. His schooling came to an abrupt end in 1938 when he graduated high school. He was accepted to the Polish officers' school. They wouldn't take him because of the fact that he was Jewish. So in 1938, with the brains that he had, his career came to a sudden end. And the family decided that the only way that we can handle this would be to accumulate enough money and eventually send him out of the country to continue his studies. And we would have done that if the war had not interfered. My sister, Bluma, was a very pretty girl. She was the only girl in the household, and she enjoyed all kinds of privileges because of that. She was the apple of my father's eye. The most beautiful part about my sister was that she never left the sight of my mother and father. And she stayed with them throughout, even though she could have saved her life. As far as being heroic, she was the one that was most heroic of us all. Eli, he was born in 1923, and Eli was what we all know and call a tough guy. He couldn't take the abuse from the Gentile boys, and he didn't. He fought back. He was constantly in trouble. And
In trouble with your father or trouble with?
in trouble with everybody. He was in trouble with my father because he had the wrong friends. And the reason he had the wrong friends is because he always wanted to fight back, because he couldn't take the abuse. If a Polish kid called him dirty Jew, he couldn't let him get away with it. And that created all kinds of problems. So he was constantly in fights. And he'd come home with black and blue marks, with eyes, with torn pants and torn jackets and all kinds of wounds. He was in constant trouble, and he was constantly fighting. Unfortunately, he eventually paid for this toughness with his life under the Germans, because he resisted a foreman on the job after the foreman had ridiculed him to the point where he couldn't take it anymore, and he hit back. And because he hit back, he was tortured and then shot.
So at this point, my father was 14 years old and was all alone. A few months later, when he turned 15, in January of 1943, he was sent to a concentration camp called Blizhen in a nearby town, where he spent 16 months as a prisoner, with hunger a constant companion. All belongings had to be surrendered except for shoes and belts. My father desperately wanted to keep pictures of all the members of his family as well as his friends. These pictures were his greatest treasure, the last link to the world of his childhood. So while he stood in line For a body search in the cold weather, he desperately tried to stuff these pictures into his shoe. He was in the middle of the line when Paul Nell, the Nazi camp commandant, pulled a boy of about 14 away from the table. He ripped the boy's shoe away from him and pulled out a handful of pictures. He tore the pictures into shreds and scattered them into the mud. And then he took out his gun and shot the boy point blank in the forehead. So when it was my father's turn, he gave up his pictures, and with it, the last connection to humanity as he once knew it.
I tell you, what gave me the desire to survive was something else. And this camp was, as I said, a terrible place. And epidemics would break out periodically. And one of the epidemics, I fell victim to a typhus epidemic, and I got sick. You know, maybe 1 out of 3 survived. I remember there was a fellow by the name of Saul Mintzberg, who was one of the inmate administrators at the camp, who helped me after my sickness. And for some reason, he was very good to me. And this human exchange, you know, and the fact that not everybody is so bad, that gave me hope, and it helped a great deal. And he brought me in, and he gave me another job in Vision, and he helped me out. He took me to the kitchen after my sickness, and he told the cook to give me extra rations every day until I recovered. It was things like this in the camp that a young man of my age was able to start life anew, get new hope, and get going again, and face whatever was coming one more time.
At Blishin, my father narrowly escaped death on many occasions and witnessed unspeakable horrors that were perpetrated by this cruel Nazi commandant, Paul Nell. In June of 1944, he was sent from Blishin to Auschwitz.
When I arrived, I was tattooed.
And what was your number?
B1477.
And again, would you repeat how old you were when this happened to you?
It was 1944. That makes me 17 years old.
As you know, this is the train entrance to Auschwitz through which cattle cars carrying hundreds of thousands of Jews and others from all over Europe arrived. His work detail was close to the arrival ramp and the crematorium. And from this vantage point, my father witnessed the arrival of many transports. He witnessed the selections. He witnessed the walk to the gas chambers. He witnessed the destruction of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. This is a picture of the arrival ramp in the summer of 1944, when a transport from Hungary had just arrived.
There was one point where a train came in from Hungary, and a lot of Hungarian people came out, and they were in the Jewish garb. You know, they were religious Orthodox people, and a lot of them walked from the ramp into the gas chamber with the prayer books wide open and praying and shaking, praying and shaking. And I remember we were not allowed to speak to them, even though they passed us by they passed us within a few feet. And I remember one time there was a very learned looking, I would say a rabbi, beard, with an open book. And for some reason, they stopped. There was something going on ahead, and they stopped for a while. And he looked at me, and he looked at me. And he said, "Du bist Yid."
Which means?
You're a Jew. And I said nothing because we weren't allowed to talk to them. And I was afraid to talk to them. And then if I did, what was I going to tell him? But he insisted. And he said to me, are we going al Kiddush Hashem? You understand what that means? And I was afraid to answer, and I couldn't say anything, and I didn't want to tell him. But I remember saying in Yiddish, it would be a good time, Rabbi, for the Messiah to come right now. This is what I said to him.
What is his reaction?
Had the order to march on, and he marched on. To oblivion. Most Sundays, hangings took place in the main square of Camp D in Auschwitz, where I was stationed. After the hangings, they had a tremendous orchestra with probably the best musicians in Europe at the time, because as the trains arrived, the first questions that the SS asked, are there any musicians here? And they would pluck them out. So they had accumulated probably, the best musicians in the world. And they had a orchestra which comprised at least 50 to 60 men playing. And these people were playing every Sunday. They gave concerts after the hangings.
In their uniforms?
You mean in the stripes?
Yes.
Yeah, in their uniforms. There was a lectern, there was an orchestra leader. And I remember there was a cordoned off sections for the Germans, for those who were not inmates, who came to listen to the concerts. And I know for a fact that the concert couldn't start until the town church let out. There was a time when the town church let out, and they had to give these Germans who attended church time to make it to the camp so they could listen to the concert. Do you understand the implication? I don't know. I need to live many years to be able to describe what I saw on that ramp. They were killing Poles, and they were killing Russians, and their lives were almost as bad as ours. But they were not. There was no genocide of Poles. There's no genocide of Russians, and they were not sending them into the crematorium. They were not sending them into the gas chamber. That was reserved primarily for Jews and, in a few instances, for gypsies. The Gentile boys that worked with me on that commando, who witnessed what I witnessed, the arrival and the whole procedure and the gassing and all that, they were totally convinced that this terrible misfortune that had befallen the Jews happened because of what the priests told them in the Catholic churches, that the Jews are getting it because they rejected Christ. They were so convinced on that point, they took it as a matter of fact, they took it as a gospel, that the Jews are being punished for rejecting Christ. There was absolutely no question in their minds.
May I ask, was it your opinion at that time that the townspeople knew what was going on?
Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody knew what was going on.
On any of your work missions, did you ever have any contact with town people?
Always. As a matter of fact, on one of the jobs that I worked, there were Swiss people who were working in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, on a contract
To
build barracks. Okay, a Swiss firm had bid on a contract to build barracks in Auschwitz, and these were civil engineers that were sent by their firms, and they used the slave labor from Auschwitz to do their work. Now, don't tell me they didn't know what Auschwitz was about. Of course they did. Everybody did.
After 5 months, in November of 1944, Auschwitz was evacuated. The Russians were approaching. And my father was now in an interim camp called Liberos, where he had little access to food. And after about 6 weeks, he was emaciated and losing his will to live. And each day outside, the temperature was well below zero. In January of 1945, a request was made for mechanics. 500 men, including my father, stepped forward, hoping to escape the terrible conditions at Liberos. There were no tools to assess who was qualified, and thankful for what he had learned in the clandestine school, he passed an oral test by answering the question, how do you measure the circumference of a circle? And although he was not a mechanic, he was chosen and sent with 60 others to a town on the Baltic Sea and then to an island called Peenemund, where the production of the V-2 rocket continued in underground factories. Outside, it was snowing and the wind was blowing brutally. A group of prisoners marched into the camp and dumped several bodies from hand-drawn wheelbarrows. The bodies were frozen stiff. My father asked a prisoner next to him, where did they come from? From the commando that shovels snow at the airfield, he said. Every day, the prisoners who have no other jobs are sent to the airfield to keep the runways open. If you want to live, don't ever get on that commando. And he was assigned to be in a group that reported to a kind German man named Herr Kind, who quickly assessed that my father was not a trained mechanic. And he said, I'm sorry, I can't use you. My father broke down and cried. Please, sir, he begged, if you reject me, they'll send me to the airfield to shovel snow, and I won't last a week there. And he told him of Liberos and why he pretended to be a mechanic. Herr Kind took pity on him and assigned my father the special task of keeping the machines lubricated. And although he was always hungry, he was holding his own as long as he didn't have to work outdoors in the bitter cold. But then came a day that Herr Kind did not show up for work. My father had lost his benefactor, and he was transferred to the airfield. The cold was so bitter and the wind so ferocious it was difficult to breathe. 2 guards informed the inmates that anyone stepping beyond the staked out area would be shot. But after several days of exposure to the elements, my father didn't have the strength to live. He slept only fitfully, his short life spinning in and out of dreams, blurred images of his parents, brothers, and sister. He began to long to join them. One freezing morning, he walked over to the nearest guard and asked permission to relieve himself. On the way, he made the decision to keep walking past the staked out area under penalty of death. Better to be shot by a guard than brought back as a frozen cadaver. He thought of his mother's face. He wanted this vision to be his last. Waiting for the shot to ring out and holding his head high to be a better target, he heard yelling, "Stop, or I'll shoot." My father kept walking, and then he heard footsteps behind him. It was the guard. "You didn't shoot," my father said. "I never killed anyone yet. I'm not going to start with you." And later on, when the camp commandant heard his story, his job with Herr Kind was reinstated. He slowly built up his strength. Over the next 4 weeks, he was on a cattle car, taken to an evacuated German military base called Bergen. One morning, the SS guards disappeared. The air raid sirens blew. A trio of American planes appeared overhead. Liberation. And here, my father reads from his manuscript about that day.
On April 15th, I looked out the window and I saw downstairs British Tommies with a armored vehicle, 5-pointed Allied star on it. The Allies had arrived. I held my head in my hands. I no longer cared about food. I knew I would never crawl again. Questions kept popping into my head. Who am I? What am I? Where am I? Is anyone left of my family? Will they be alive as I once knew it? Eventually, I pulled myself together and went downstairs. British soldiers were all over the camp dispensing crackers and a milk-like substance. Strangely, I found my need for revenge had already left. With my English, I had learned at Miss Sobel's clandestine school. I asked the British officer about the state of the war. The Nazis kaputt was his answer. Those were the sweetest words I heard all my life. The real shock of liberation came a few days later when the Polish survivors of Bergen-Belsen arranged the liberation ball. I walked into the hall dressed in a jacket and slacks obtained from the Red Cross, feeling like a human being for the first time in years. The band was playing a song called Chrysanthemums Złociste, Golden Chrysanthemums. At that point, the memory of my experiences clashed with the unlimited possibilities of my future. My feet below the knees went numb. I grabbed a chair and barely managed to sit down. A pretty girl noticed and came over to me. "Hi, my name is Rainer. Are you all right?" "I think so," I said. "It's just that this is so much." She sat down next to me. "I know," she said. "I'm Jewish too. I survived the war with my mother by pretending to be Polish Catholics who I thought were the only Jews who made it. I know the feeling. My name is Josip, and I'm so very happy to meet you." I was still struggling to express my feelings when she threw her hands around my neck. "Never mind that now. Come, let's dance." And so we danced that night. Oh, how we danced.
We must listen to the voices of the past. We, the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, represent the continuation of their lives. We embody them wherever we are at any given moment. We are the proof of their existence. We reflect their light. We honor their memory. Bret Stephens, journalist for the New York Times, reflects, "We are members of a religion that cherishes life and memory alike and believes that we live best and understand best when we remember well. In this month of Holocaust remembrance, it's worth pausing to consider how those who survived help us to see what we must never forget." This is a picture at Treblinka. It is a memorial there. It's called the Garden of Memories. And each stone that you see here represents a city. And the size of the stone represents the number of Jews from that city who were murdered here. This is the stone that says Radom, which marks the final resting place of my father's mother, father, and sister Bluma. And it is also the significance of the title of his book, Mark It With a Stone.
This is a picture of myself taken probably several weeks after we were liberated. For better or for worse, this is what I looked like. I had already gained a few pounds, but I was still pretty skinny. Probably no more than 120 pounds at the time. In the back where I point is my mother. That is the best picture that I have of her. I have no other. And in front, right here where I point, is my sister Bluma. This is the only thing that I have of my sister and my mother. This is a picture taken of myself and my wife, Dinah, probably a few days after she came to the United States. As I said, I came here in the beginning of 1947. She came in the summer of 49. So this is the summer of 49. And if I remember correctly, it's probably one of the first pictures we took, the two of us together, after her arrival.
And here's a short clip that shows a little bit about what life was like after.
My great dream and desire was to survive, to bear witness. That was the greatest desire I had, was to survive and bear witness.
And this is a photo that we took in 2014 when my mom was still with us, our family. And we took this photo 2 Passovers ago, pre-pandemic, of our family today. These are the 3 sisters, my sister Bonnie, my sister Ellen, our husbands and children. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Angelique, I'm going to move forward now. I was going to do this later, but I am so touched and so emotional. I think that this is the proper time. So I hope you can see that I have a small candle here that I've lit. And this is in memory of the 6 million murdered during the Holocaust. I guess you can't see it. Let's see if I can. Maybe you can see it now. May their memories be a blessing, and may their memories motivate us to end prejudice. Thank you, Sandy. It was quite emotional. Do some of you have some questions that you would like to ask? If you put them in the chat, that would be fine. I mean, I have so many. I did read the book over the weekend, and I guess what so impressed me in the book, and also after this presentation, is what I perceive is the gentleness of your father. Certainly strong, I realize that, but so gentle. And I wonder what it was like growing up for you and your sisters with your father and your mother.
Well, I was very lucky. My sisters and I consider ourselves to have been very lucky, even though there was a backdrop of shadows and sadness that we did not quite understand. But we grew up in the bosom of their love. My parents were madly in love with each other. They were young and vital and full of life and hope. And we did not grow up with any anger or revenge. In fact, quite the opposite. There was such joy in life growing up that, I mean, I remember when we were little, on Sundays, my dad would take me and my sister Bonnie and my 2 cousins and my uncle, and we would go to Coney Island. And that's when the mother stayed home to clean the house or whatever they were doing. And we had the best time. I mean, it was a day of delight. And I remember all the rides and the skee ball. And then, of course, the highlight, we would go to Nathan's. And we had just many opportunities as a family to celebrate life. What was strange is that as all children of immigrants, I think, feel, my mother did not speak English as well as my dad did. And so oftentimes I was her voice. And I didn't realize that that was something strange, of course, until I was much older. I didn't know that it could be any different. Like when we would go on the subway, I could be maybe 7, 8 years old, and I would buy the tokens. Or my mother would send me to the bakery and I would get seedless rye, lightly baked slice at the age of 7 or 8, and not think anything of that. I was also very protective of them growing up. I felt like if anyone made fun of my mother because she had an accent, that was not a good thing. And then I had other experiences because we spoke three languages in the house, Polish, Yiddish, and English, although I didn't know a lot of the Polish, just a few phrases and words. I didn't really know what word came from what language. So I remember in kindergarten, the teacher sent me to the bathroom to get a basin. Remember, we used to put the erasers in the water and then, clean the blackboards. So I went to the bathroom. I looked around. I didn't see a basin. I came back and I said, "There's no basin in the bathroom." And the teacher sent someone else who came back with a basin. And she called me up like this and she said, "Why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me there was no basin in the bathroom?" And I looked at her. I said, "That's not a basin. That's a schissel." So I only knew the Yiddish word for it. I didn't know the English word. So I had a few instances like that. Like my mother would send me to school with lunch and I would, open my lunch and another kid would say, "Ew, what is that you're eating?" And I would look at that kid like he had three heads. And I said, "What do you mean? It's a mixture." So, like everybody had peanut butter and jelly or tuna fish sandwiches. And I had a mixture, which actually was sliced hard-boiled egg, lettuce, and tomato. But I didn't know that other people didn't have such a sandwich. So I had quite a few of those experiences. But we wanted to know what happened. Where were all those missing people? And when I found that notebook, that was the beginning of when we were able to ask more questions. And my father was very measured in what it was he revealed to us. And as I mentioned in the program, that it really wasn't until I read the manuscript for his memoir. And because I've been an English teacher, we had that relationship. He wanted me to read it and give him feedback on it as well. So that was when I first uncovered the depth, of the disastrous conditions that he had survived.
So somebody in the chat has asked, did he ever talk about being angry, and how did he or they handle it at the time?
I don't remember them being angry. I do remember that we were expected to read the newspaper. We were expected to know what was happening in the world. We were expected to know what was happening to Jews around the world, what was happening in Israel. And at the dinner table, when we were a little bit older, we would have these political conversations about it. And it was like a second education that I had at home about this topic. And it was a passionate topic of his. And he wanted us to be very aware. And I think when there was an unjust situation, he would become even more strong about his opinions. And he'd written also several letters to the editor of the New York Times. He had an op-ed actually at one point that was published in the New York Times. So he was the person who would speak out. So there wasn't anger in the sense that I don't remember any anger. And we would also have, we had a lot of cousins. We didn't really have cousins. We had very few actual blood cousins, but all of the Holocaust survivors who were from Radom, who lived in the New York area, would come over to our house all the time. And my mother was a wonderful hostess, and she loved to cook and to bake. And so we were surrounded by this chatter. The men would play cards, the women would chat, the kids were all running around. It was great. It was great. And there was just this closeness about being together. And that's what I remember. And it's interesting because in his clip about when he was liberated, he says, strangely, my need for revenge had already left me. So he was already anticipating, this clash of what he had experienced and the hope and the possibilities of his future. He was only 18 years old. 19 years old when the war was over. So, his experiences did not limit him at all. And I know I've read other memoirs or other, like, for example, the story of Mouse. I don't know how many of you have read that, but that was a very angry Holocaust survivor. But each individual is different. And this particular survivor was older and had lost a child and was in a very different emotional place. So I don't know. There's no way to pass any judgment over what anybody else did as a survivor and how they lived their lives. But my parents were not angry. They believed in justice. My father was not happy when Germany was reunited. He was not happy when Reagan went to Bitburg and he went to the graves of the SS. We knew when he didn't like something, but it wasn't anger. It was more like, this is right, this is wrong. This is what I believe, and this is why I believe it, etc.
Strong value of justice.
Yeah.
So somebody has asked, and I think you've somewhat answered this a bit, did your parents have siblings that survived, and where did your cousins come from?
My mother, actually, she came from a family of 8. There were 6 children. She was the youngest. She lost her parents in a ruse where they actually had taken a group of 100 Jews from Radom, and they actually sent them to Palestine. This was another opportunity. But what in effect was happening was that they really wanted to get rid of the intelligentsia. And my mother's father was a successful businessman, a wealthy man. And my mother's oldest brother had been studying at the Sorbonne to become a doctor, but unfortunately he came back from France, he came back to Poland. So they actually were taken on a truck, and they were driven to a nearby cemetery in a nearby town where they were all shot. So that's how my mother lost her parents. But she and her brother became a partisan, and he was also, we don't know what happened to her brother. Nobody knows what happened. Nobody who survived knows what happened to him. So she had 4 other sisters, and all 5 sisters survived, except the most tragic and unfortunate story was when they were living in Stuttgart in the DP camp. My mother's sister, Manya, who was the middle of the 5 sisters, had an accident. She was riding on the back of a motorcycle with the man she had fallen in love with, and there was an accident and she died. So to have survived all of that, and then one of my mother's sisters had been separated. She was not, 3 of them were together, and one of them was separated, and eventually they did reunite in Stuttgart. So my mother survived ultimately with 3 sisters. One was here in the United States with us. Those were the cousins that we went to Coney Island, and we were together all the time growing up. One other sister went to Israel because her husband's father had survived, which was very unusual, and he wanted to go to Israel. And my mother's other sister went to Australia because her husband's sister had gone to Australia. So after all this time, they had been separated, except for my Aunt Jeanette, who was here. And my parents left Brooklyn when I was 16. They bought a house in Glen Rock, and my aunt and uncle bought a house across the street in Glen Rock. So we were together there as well. And we took trips to Israel, and my my aunt from Israel and my cousins came here and spent a summer, I remember. And my son and daughter both went to Australia for their junior year abroad. So my husband and I went to Australia and we met some cousins we had never met before. And it was so strange because I said to my husband, oh my God, look at him. He looks just like my nephew, Jonathan. It was like looking at people who look like your family that you had never met before. So, but we are in touch, you know, we do email and we do communicate, but it's hard, you know, the generations continue to grow and we're not all, you know, the younger ones are not necessarily in touch in the way that we would want to. But family was the number one important thing. My mother would always say, blood is thicker than water. And she and my Aunt Jeanette fought all the time. They fought, but they made up. They fought and they made up. And that was the way, you know, to me, I would never understand how anybody could stop speaking to people or in the family or, you know, that was an unheard of concept for me growing up.
So Elaine Meyerson has asked, did your father testify against a Nazi?
Yeah, I did not include that in the program. It was hard for me to try to keep it tailored. But yes, in 1973, he was called to Hamburg, Germany to testify at the war crimes trial of this Blizhen SS commander, Paul Nell, because my father was the only surviving witness. And based on his testimony, Nell was convicted for crimes against humanity and murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. And in his book, he talks more about what happened during that time, where he didn't know that Nell would be positioned in the same hotel as my dad was staying in, and he did have the phone number of someone to call if he was going to be very emotional and so on. So sure enough, one day he walked out of the hotel and he saw this man walking down the street a little bit ahead of him, and he knew right away that it was Nell. He could tell by his gait, which was the same. The only thing missing was his German Shepherd that was always at his side. And he just, you know, he had a total meltdown. And he called this number, and I guess, you know, ultimately he calmed down. But when he was a man who spoke 5 languages fluently. He was just had an aptitude for language and he absorbed the language. So he knew German, he spoke German, but in that trial, he refused to speak German. He only spoke English. So it was quite a harrowing experience for him. I can't even imagine. But he wanted to go.
Clearly a very amazing man. And I must say, handsome. When we had our little rehearsal on Tuesday, I'll just share this. Sandy put up a picture of her dad, that first picture. And I just went, wow, so handsome.
Yeah.
And of course, all the way through he is, but
right.
It's not about necessarily being handsome, but he definitely was handsome. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm happy. I'm curious, Sandy. I know you've spent a lot of time teaching, I think, primarily school children. I'm not sure, maybe adolescents. I'm not sure of the age. What's their reaction when you provide Holocaust education?
You know, the first book that I used to teach about the Holocaust was Number of the Stars, and many of you may be familiar with the story. It's based on a true story about the Danish rescue, and it's by Lois Lowry, who's a wonderful, wonderful writer and an excellent speaker. She actually came to school and she spoke, and you know, it was sort of an opening introduction to children about, I would say, 11 years old or so, to understand that we all have choices to make. Each one of us has a voice and a choice. That is my message to children. Who are you going to be? Look what happened in Denmark during the war, because everyone protected the Jews. It's an incredible story, but yet it happened. And why did it happen? So, that conversation about, well, the main character, Anne Marie, and her family are Christian, and they chose to help the Anne Marie's Jewish friend at what cost, and then there was a lot of conversation about consequences for doing the right thing and how hard that is to do. And like, what does that mean in their own lives? Because we all have choices that we make. So I think that's my introduction. When I talk to the older kids, after going to the Shoah Foundation and becoming a master teacher there in LA, and then also spending 3 summers a week after 3 years at the Holocaust Museum in DC to become a master teacher fellow, it's an incredibly outlined and very clear way to present the sequence, the timeline, what happened, where were the decisions along the way that changed the course of history. I think the main idea for me is to make it relevant to today. History happens to ordinary people like you and me. And I have to say, I've spoken many, many schools around the country. I've spoken in London, and the reaction is exactly the same. Even if I speak to middle school kids who are notoriously rowdy, especially during an assembly, you could hear a pin drop. It's a personal story, and the kids, each of them has a mother, a father, a sister, a brother. Many of them are immigrant children of immigrants too, that I speak to. So I think that kids are very, very interested in what happened, and they have more questions. They have more questions, and questions that I don't have answers to. But I've always said I like good questions better than good answers to my kids. But it helps them to think and to process it, and then to ask questions. It's really pretty amazing to watch those kids when they listen to the story. Yeah, it makes it
So
very
Gladys has asked, how did your father get to the United States?
My father was lucky enough to get a job with the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in the DP camp in Stuttgart. And the woman who was in charge was an American woman named Flora Levine. And she took a liking to him. And because of her, she's the one who gave him an affidavit and a visa in order to come to America, because he didn't have any relatives here. He knew no one here. And, she did this for him. And he tells the story in one of his clips. He had saved several mementos, and he talks about them, like the picture he had of his sister and his mother. And this is a letter of recommendation that Flora Levine had written for him on a typed piece of paper. It's yellowed, it's like ripped, it's taped together. And in it, Joseph Horn worked for us, and he took care of the packages, and he did X, Y, and Z, and so on, with her name, with the stamp of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. So he tells the story about when he's here in this country and he's looking for a job, and he has to apply. And apparently there are 20 other young men who are also vying for this job. And you had to have a high school diploma, and he did not have a high school diploma, unfortunately. But he went to this interview with this recommendation, this letter. And when he met with the boss, he whipped out this letter, and he saw the boss look at the letter, read the letter, look at my father, read the letter. He knew right away that he got the job. And sure enough, that night he got the call that he was hired. And although that job was not necessarily the job that led to what it is he would ultimately do with his life, but it was very uplifting. And so he came here in January of 1947.
Your dad was, from reading the book, he was very strategic, very careful how he made decisions while he was in the worst situations. When some of you do read the book, you'll learn that. Very decisive why he would do certain things. And he certainly knew, just as he clearly befriended this person that helped him get to the United States, he knew how to make friends. And he knew how, I mean, he knew how to make friends and be a friend in order for him to survive. That, at least that's one of the messages I took back from reading the book. And now somebody has asked, did your dad ever finish his education in the United States?
Yes, he did. He got his high school equivalency, and actually when he retired from his business, which was a hat manufacturing business, he manufactured hats and baseball caps and was a very successful businessman. His factory, by the way, was on Broadway and Prince Street in Soho. And the factory, he closed the business sometime in the 80s, during the time when all of the factories and the manufacturing was going overseas to China. But that gave him time to write his memoir. And he went to NYU and took courses there, writing courses and so on. He was always a good writer anyway, and very fluent with the language. But the courses that he took and the stories that he would write for this course, which I read as well, really helped him along the way to be able to put his memories into this book in a way that was captivating and well written. So he didn't get a college degree, but he was a self-educated man anyway. He was an avid reader, and he was the kind of man who was, he was sort of a brainiac, but he was also an athlete. You know, he played a very mean game of tennis. He was also a card player, and a good card player. So the men loved him, the women loved him. He was a good dancer. He was really just, he was a very special person, and his glow lives on in us.
Well, I think that is truly a very excellent statement. And if no one really has another question, I would agree. His glow does live on in you, Sandy. It's very, very clear from listening to you and watching your expression. It's very clear.
I'd like to.
Go ahead. I think somebody wants to ask a question.
No, it's Peggy. I would just like to say something.
Go ahead.
As you know, I guess you explained, Barry Lynn, that I was supposed to do the opening remarks, and my iPad died in Florida, and not just my iPad, but the whole section was out. So fortunately, we're able to get on Carol's phone, on her data. So, so because I didn't do opening remarks, I would just like to say in closing, Sandy, the story was amazing. You told it so beautiful, so beautifully. And I can only say thank you. Thank you.
Peggy, I'm so happy that you did come on.
It took a while. And, you know, we're in 3 different rooms, and I was running from door to door, banging on the door, you know, got to get on. And, you know, and then Carol found out it was just not my iPhone. It was the whole area that was out. But then because she says, you know, she's our techie person, she was able to get on with her data on her phone. So we did get on a little bit late, but again, it was remarkable. And thank you, Sandy.
Thank you for having me.
So again, I'm really thrilled that you were able to come and story. I want to say to everyone on another thought. I hope you all enjoyed the creative, non-perishable, kosher surprise lunch and the beautiful packaging. I will tell you that Karen Curlin and Paula Schwartz, who I'm sure are somewhere in the audience in the gallery, really paid particular attention to everything. And I think you probably all noticed, they were concerned at one point that if they mailed the packages, and because you can't depend on the postal service these days, that these packages would arrive during Passover. And they knew it wasn't kosher for Passover. So I'm sure you noticed that they had a sticker put on it creatively that said not for Passover. In the meantime, once they saw the attendance list, they creatively were able to deliver, I would say about in person, about 90% of the lunches. They had the help of Joan Teichman and Paula Starr, and I'm not sure, maybe there were others that also helped out. It was our first attempt to deliver something during a program. Thank you to both of them. They were really very creative and thoughtful. And of course, thank you to Peggy Kabaka. As you all know, she has been Yom HaShoah chair for many, many years, and she did an excellent job with today's program. I do have some announcements to make. It wouldn't be an NCJW Bergen County program if we didn't give some upcoming events, some coming events. So on Tuesday, April 20th is our April general meeting, and we will hear the retelling of his childhood. Dr. Bernd Walschlager will retell the story of his childhood growing up in Germany prior to the Holocaust. And so the name of our program is The Jewish Son of a Nazi Officer, and you will learn what happened to the Jewish son of the Nazi officer. And then on Tuesday, May 6th, Timely Topics, Kitty Zeldis, author, will discuss her book, Not Our Kind, about two women in 1947, New York. A very different story about 1947 in New York, because Sandy's dad came to New York in 1947. And when I was reading Not Our Kind over the weekend, I was just struck by that. And then knowing that we were going to have a very different book about life in New York City in 1947. And for those of you who maybe were little or maybe weren't even born in 1947, I will tell you that you will find as you read the book things that will bring memories back to you, because I think things that were happening in 1947 also were happening in the 50s and early 60s. There are many pieces that brought memories back to me. I didn't grow up in New York City, but I did grow up in the late 40s and early 50s in a very protective environment in New England, but nonetheless, you will have some memories. And as Paula Schwartz has said, it is a gripping and entertaining book, and it's a page turner. And then on Thursday, May 13th, we're going on another virtual trip. And this time we're going to Russia and New York. Really, we're going to Brighton Beach, Little Odessa, and Coney Island. So it will be the beginning of May, it's springtime, and we'll be at the beach. So you can find all of these events in Council Connections scheduled, which it will be in your inbox on Monday, April 12th. It will also be on our website. I invite you to read through it. There are many other events coming up in May and June. And with that, I'm going to officially close. If any of you would like to stay on, if you have some burning questions, Sandy has agreed to stay. and we will take everybody off mute and have it more informal during that period. But if some of you do have, scheduled things that you need to leave, we understand, and we hope to see you soon at something special. So I think Ginny has raised